According to sources within the Baltic Fleet Command, the morning began like any other. The harbor was quiet, the mist still hanging low over the water, muffling the sound of engines and footsteps on steel decks. Dock workers moved slowly through the cold air, inspecting hulls, checking moorings, exchanging brief words without expression. Nothing seemed out of place, until the silence itself became suspicious. Those who were there say it felt as if the port was holding its breath. For weeks, there had been whispers among naval engineers of strange orders coming from Moscow. Sudden inspections, new security protocols, coded directives marked Priority 1. Officially, these were routine drills, but behind closed doors, officers spoke of something else entirely. Heightened alert status, restricted communications, unmarked vessels docked at night and gone by dawn. Something was moving beneath the surface of normality, a slow, invisible tension winding tighter with each tide. The canal itself, the artery linking the Baltic Fleet to open waters, had been restless for months. Satellite data showed unusual dredging activity, convoys of barges operating under blackout conditions, and transport containers never listed in the official manifest. Local fishermen reported being pushed back miles from usual routes, told it was temporary maintenance. But those who knew the sea said otherwise. The water changed, one veteran captain whispered. It felt heavier. By dawn, the mist over the port thickened into a kind of silence that felt rehearsed. Surveillance footage later reviewed by investigators captured the final minutes before disaster. A line of naval engineers walking toward Berth 7, the dock where one of the fleet's advanced corvette-class vessels was undergoing refit. A standard procedure, a routine check, but one of the engineers, according to an internal report, stopped halfway down the pier, hesitated, and looked toward the ship, as if sensing something wrong. A moment later, the footage cuts out. At exactly 8:17 local time, the water beneath the corvette erupted. A column of fire and steam tore through the mist, followed by a low, rolling shockwave that rattled windows across the port. Those nearby described it as a thunderclap from the sea. The blast threw debris hundreds of meters into the air. Fragments rained across the canal like metallic hail. Within seconds, alarms blared from every direction, the kind that signal not an accident, but an attack. Official statements would later describe the event as a localized explosion caused by a technical malfunction. But inside the base, no one believed that. Naval personnel, trained to recognize the sound of detonations, spoke of something far more deliberate. A deep, concussive blast consistent with an internal breach, possibly in the munitions compartment. Yet even that explanation didn't fit. The corvette had been dry-loaded, its ammunition removed weeks earlier. So where did the explosion come from? As the fire consumed the ship, the canal itself began to burn. Oil slicks ignited, spreading a black sheen across the surface, transforming the calm harbor into a mirror of flame. The air filled with the stench of diesel and salt, thick and choking. The sea, once the Navy's shield, turned against it. And through the smoke, a single haunting sound echoed. The ship's emergency klaxon, looping endlessly, long after her crew had vanished. In the first hour after the explosion, communication lines inside the base collapsed. Radio silence was imposed. No one was allowed to transmit, even to request aid. The order came directly from Fleet Command. Lock all frequencies. No external contact. To the sailors still fighting the fires, it felt like betrayal, as if the command feared words more than flames. One survivor later told investigators, "We knew something bigger was being hidden." You could feel it in how fast they told us to stop talking. By mid-morning, Moscow issued its first official statement. No casualties, minor incident under control. But satellite images released by foreign observers told another story. A crater in the port basin, scorched infrastructure, emergency vehicles clustered around what was left of the ship. The scale of destruction was impossible to conceal. And yet, state television broadcast smiling anchors assuring viewers that scheduled naval operations continue as planned. In the city of Baltisk, closest to the blast zone, residents heard the explosion but saw nothing. Police sealed the waterfront within minutes, blocking access to the canal, confiscating phones, threatening journalists. By noon, a thick column of smoke still hung over the horizon, visible for miles, while local news insisted it was a planned test of emergency systems. The denial was almost theatrical, too immediate, too absolute. When truth is dangerous, speed becomes a weapon. Inside the fleet, fear spread faster than fire. Officers whispered of sabotage, some blamed foreign intelligence, others suspected internal power struggles. The most disturbing theory, circulating quietly among mid-level commanders, was that the blast wasn't an attack at all, but a message. A signal from within the system itself, sent in the only language it still understands: destruction. By dusk, the water was calm again, but the calm felt unnatural, the stillness after a scream. Rescue divers worked in silence under the glow of floodlights, their faces pale when they resurfaced. What they found below was worse than anyone expected. The hull of the corvette had been ripped not from the outside, but from within. The official report will never admit it, the cameras will never show it. But the men who saw the wreckage know what it means. Something exploded inside the heart of Russia's own fleet, and not by accident. Somewhere in the smoke and salt, the truth is still sinking. Stay with us. What follows next was not meant to reach the surface, but it will. Subscribe, because the sea has started to whisper secrets again, and this time, someone is listening. According to classified briefings reviewed by Western maritime analysts, the explosion in the Baltic Canal was not an isolated malfunction. It was the visible symptom of a system collapsing under its own secrecy. Within hours of the blast, internal communications between the Baltic Fleet Command and Moscow's Ministry of Defense became erratic, fragmented, and then abruptly encrypted under the highest clearance level. That kind of blackout, insiders say, only occurs in two scenarios: nuclear incidents or sabotage from within. Officially, it was neither. Unofficially, it was both. From the outside, Moscow moved fast to construct a narrative. State television aired footage of what it claimed was the same corvette under maintenance days after the explosion. A clumsy attempt to suggest the ship was intact. But analysts comparing satellite imagery quickly exposed the deception. The vessel shown on TV had different hull markings, older radar systems, and a damaged stern that had been digitally erased. The cover-up was too rushed, too confident. It was the reflex of a regime that assumes disbelief is harmless so long as the population stays quiet. Inside the naval base, the mood was anything but quiet. Survivors of the blast were sequestered in a medical facility under armed guard. Their families told nothing. The few who managed to send messages out described symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic fumes, a detail never mentioned in official reports. It wasn't just an explosion, one of them wrote before his account vanished. The air burned. By midday, investigators from the Federal Security Service arrived in Baltisk. Their presence signaled what everyone already feared. This was no accident, and someone was going to pay for it. Witnesses were detained, officers interrogated for hours without counsel. The questioning, according to one source, focused not on how the explosion occurred, but on who spoke first. In the Russian military, information leaks are treated as treason, even when the truth is the only thing that could save lives. Meanwhile, foreign intelligence began piecing together its own mosaic. US and European surveillance satellites detected a heat signature inconsistent with a simple fuel detonation. The blast, they concluded, originated deep inside the corvette's lower decks, precisely where classified weapon systems were stored. Those compartments were supposed to be empty. The question then shifted from what exploded to why was it there at all. The most disturbing theory comes from sources within the Russian defense industry itself. They claim the corvette was part of an unregistered weapons transfer, an experimental system meant to counter NATO's naval dominance in the Baltic. Some describe it as a new-generation anti-ship missile, others, more cryptically, as a reactive energy payload. Whatever it was, the technology was unstable, untested, and under political pressure to perform. The explosion may not have been sabotage, it may have been the inevitable result of arrogance. The Kremlin's internal investigation, codenamed Operation Veil, now operates under total secrecy. Even senior admirals are excluded from the process. The few official statements that reach the press insist that the situation is localized. But those words ring hollow when entire sections of the port remain sealed off, when divers continue to recover metallic fragments from depths they refuse to measure, when the air above the harbor still smells faintly of ozone and burning metal. In the international community, the reaction is cautious but grim. NATO has increased reconnaissance flights over the Baltic Sea, though publicly denying any involvement. European officials express concern, while quietly preparing for environmental fallout. The canal's blackened waters now leaking into open sea. Marine biologists report mass fish die-offs, consistent with chemical contamination. It's as if the ocean itself is reacting to what humanity tried to hide beneath it. Inside Russia, the political consequences are beginning to ripple. The Ministry of Defense blames foreign interference. The Security Council blames internal negligence. The truth is that both sides are terrified, because whichever version prevails will determine who survives the next purge. Rumors spread that several officers have already retired suddenly. Others simply disappeared. The hierarchy is eating itself, one rank at a time. In Baltisk, the city lives under curfew. The streets near the canal are deserted, the harbor lights dimmed. Residents speak in whispers of strange convoys at night, trucks leaving the port under escort, their cargo covered with tarps that drip seawater. Soldiers refuse to answer questions. Some of them, locals say, look younger than 20. They move like ghosts, silent, efficient, afraid. Foreign experts monitoring the site describe the aftermath as a black tide, not just the slick of oil coating the water, but the wave of secrecy that followed. Every truth about the explosion is being absorbed by the same darkness that caused it. The more Moscow denies, the clearer the pattern becomes. This was not an isolated event, but the symptom of a decaying command structure, where obedience has replaced competence and fear has become policy. What remains of the corvette now lies at the bottom of the canal, a warped, half-buried carcass of steel. Divers say the wreck emits a low hum, as if something within it still vibrates. Whether that's machinery or imagination, no one can tell. But those who have heard it speak of unease that doesn't fade. It feels, one of them said quietly, like the ship is still alive, still warning us. Above the surface, the investigation continues, or rather, pretends to. The black tide has reached the corridors of power now, staining reputations, drowning accountability. The canal, once a symbol of access to the open sea, has become a closed wound. And somewhere deep within the bureaucracy, a single question echoes through encrypted lines. If it wasn't sabotage, then what did we build that destroyed us? Stay with us. The deeper they try to bury the truth, the louder it begins to surface. Subscribe, because beneath every calm sea lies a secret, and this one is still rising. According to reports from local administrators in Kaliningrad Oblast, the days following the explosion unfolded like a badly staged play, everyone pretending not to see the obvious. The sky over Baltisk remained veiled with smoke for 3 days. Residents awoke to find soldiers posted at intersections, rail stations closed, and entire districts suddenly labeled restricted zones. The word radiation was never spoken aloud, but people whispered it anyway. In Russia, silence is often a warning louder than any siren. Officially, the port was undergoing reconstruction. In practice, it was under quarantine. Drones circled the coastline, scanning for debris that the Navy refused to admit existed. Trucks carried sealed containers out of the harbor at night, escorted by unmarked vehicles with their plates removed. Some of the drivers wore protective masks, others didn't. They looked too tired to care what they were moving. A few days later, the local hospital received several patients suffering from chemical burns. Their names never appeared in any registry. Inside the naval base, panic hardened into discipline. The surviving officers were ordered to remain on site indefinitely. Families were evacuated quietly, without explanation. Mobile phones were confiscated, social media accounts deleted. The few sailors who managed to speak with relatives described the atmosphere as electric fear, a sense that any word could end a career, or worse. "We sleep next to wreckage," one message read before it was erased. "It hums at night. The water glows where it sank." Foreign reconnaissance images taken 2 days after the blast revealed a fleet of small patrol boats forming a cordon around the damaged section of the canal. The area shimmered with a dark iridescence, consistent with chemical residues. Environmental monitors detected trace elements of lithium and thorium, materials not found in standard naval fuel. Experts immediately drew a grim conclusion. The explosion likely involved an experimental energy module, possibly nuclear-assisted. Moscow, of course, denied it. The Kremlin's control of information was absolute, but so was its paranoia. The Ministry of Defense sent inspectors not to investigate, but to erase. Documents were shredded, personnel files deleted, CCTV archives overwritten. The goal was not to find the cause. It was to eliminate any record that the cause had ever existed. The fewer witnesses, the safer the system. The fewer questions, the longer the illusion of control could survive. Still, truth leaks like oil. It seeps through cracks in loyalty and conscience. By the end of the week, anonymous messages began circulating through encrypted channels. Photographs of twisted steel, fragments marked with radiation symbols, coordinates matching the sealed-off dock. They came with a warning written in short, clipped Russian. They are burying it in the sea. Whether it meant evidence, weapons, or bodies, no one could say. The human cost of the disaster remains unspoken, but not unseen. In Baltisk, funerals were held without names, coffins sealed, flags draped, families told not to ask questions. In one small cemetery, locals counted 27 fresh graves. No official casualty list has been published, The Navy insists there were no losses. The lie has become ritual. Among officers, morale has collapsed. Some whisper that the explosion was sabotage by internal factions, a signal from rival command circles tired of being silenced. Others blame a failed weapons test ordered directly from Moscow, rushed to prove Russia's technological dominance to a watching world. But beneath these theories lies something simpler and darker. The system is corroding from within, and no one dares to admit it. Internationally, the response is muted but watchful. NATO vessels have increased patrols across the Baltic Sea, their radars fixed on the Kaliningrad enclave. The alliance officially offers humanitarian assistance. Moscow declines, calling it provocation. Diplomats trade rehearsed phrases, pretending not to know that both sides are studying the same satellite images. The scarred port, the half-sunken corvette, the spreading black stain moving toward open waters. Inside Russia's intelligence community, the disaster is treated as both a failure and an opportunity. The FSB's counterintelligence branch reportedly seized control of the Naval Command's communications within 48 hours of the blast. Several senior officers have vanished under temporary investigation. Their offices are sealed, their families relocated. One admiral, a decorated veteran of previous operations, is said to have been found dead in his residence. Official cause, cardiac arrest. Unofficially, suicide by silence. And yet, life above the surface continues. Children still go to school, markets still open, propaganda still broadcasts patriotic optimism. But the city has changed. People no longer walk near the water. The gulls that once crowded the piers have disappeared. The sea smells wrong. Fishermen say the tides have turned sluggish, as if something beneath the surface holds them back. The locals call it Chernaya Volna, the black wave. One evening, as searchlights swept across the canal, a group of engineers gathered near the water's edge. They watched bubbles rise from where the corvette had sunk, forming perfect circles in the stillness. No one spoke. Finally, one of them murmured, "It's not over. Whatever exploded down there is still alive." Then they turned away, their faces pale in the white light, each pretending he hadn't heard himself say it. The Baltic Canal, once built as a symbol of connection, has become a fracture line, between truth and lies, between power and decay. The steel lies silent now, twisted, half-buried, reflecting only the dim light of a system that can no longer tell victory from ruin. Stay with us. The silence spreading from Baltisk is not the end. It's the sound of something still moving in the dark. Subscribe, because the next wave is already forming, and this time, it won't stay beneath the surface. By the time spring light returned to the railways, the corridor no longer existed. Not in the schedules, not in the databases, not even in the vocabulary of officials who once governed it. What remained was ritual. The illusion of continuity preserved through statements, maps, and commemorative speeches about logistical resilience. But everyone inside the system knew the bridge was gone. It had died quietly, without announcement, like a sentence cut mid-word. According to the final classified assessment reviewed by a narrow circle of ministries, the shutdown had become permanent by design. Poland would not reopen crossings, Lithuania would not mediate, Belarus would not interfere. The geopolitical wound had scarred over. Moscow could still speak of Kaliningrad as part of itself, but only in theory. The kind of belonging measured in declarations, not distance. Geography, once an ally, had turned neutral. In the Kremlin's archives, there is said to exist a single memo marked "End of Overland Viability." It was signed without ceremony, filed under Transport Adaptation Strategy. The language is bureaucratic, bloodless, but the meaning is profound. Russia has accepted its first internal exile. An entire region remains part of the state on paper, yet separated by the invisible glass of politics and geography. Kaliningrad adapted. Ships grew busier, markets rearranged, life continued. Slower, dearer, lonelier. For the younger generation, the land bridge was already mythology, a story their parents told about a time when trains came from the east and the world still felt connected. For the older ones, its loss remained personal, like an amputation that still aches when the weather changes. In Moscow, the silence hardened into doctrine. Officials began to speak of distributed sovereignty, a phrase that concealed more than it explained. It meant learning to rule what could no longer be reached. It meant convincing oneself that distance is not defeat. But inside ministries, even the most loyal clerks admitted privately that something fundamental had shifted, that the state had crossed an invisible line from empire to archipelago. Foreign analysts noticed the same transformation. They wrote of fragmented continuity, of administrative islands floating within an ocean of mistrust. But what they missed was the emotional undercurrent. The quiet grief that comes when a nation realizes that its own geography has stopped obeying it. No decree, no speech, no train can restore the feeling of wholeness once lost. One day, near the old border, a Polish guard reportedly found a note wedged between the rails. Weathered, unsigned, written in Russian. The last signal passed here. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the meaning was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, had tried to say goodbye. Whether it was a stranded engineer, a border worker, or simply the wind folding human sorrow into words, no one knows. The note was handed to superiors, logged and stored in an archive that no one will open. That is how history ends now, not with destruction, but with filing. With silence disguised as order, with loss disguised as reform. Kaliningrad remains on the map, but maps no longer matter. The new boundaries are made of bureaucracy, not barbed wire. They separate what cannot be reached and what no one dares to name as gone. And so the empire continues to function, slower, quieter, suspended between denial and memory. The shadow trains rust where they stopped. Their engines, once meant to conquer distance, now guard the secret of how fragile continuity truly is. When the next broadcast speaks of unity, remember the empty rails. When the next official promises reconnection, remember the silence that replaced the whistle. Because the story of the Kaliningrad Bridge was never about transport. It was about time, and the moment a nation discovered it could no longer move as one. Subscribe before the archives close and the echoes fade completely. Because in the end, it is not borders that disappear, it is memory. And once memory goes quiet, even the map forgets who it belonged to.